Thank you to Tim that time for pointing out that I was saying Lano instead of Lono, which is the proper pronunciation. And he did it so gently that there was absolutely no hurt in it at all. All right. Last time we're looking at Hawaiian mythology. This is our third talk. The first talk was a very long, wild introduction to everything we've done in 8 years. That didn't sound like the 8 years. And last time we began speaking about Lono. We're looking at the Trinity in Hawaiian mythology, and finally we're going to get to the theme that we're trying to get to with Hawaiian mythology tonight. We saw Lono as the third of the... just come on right in. It's third of the three divine attributes. You might say the third member of the divine Trinity. And what we noted that it was that the third in Hawaiian Trinity was so much like the thirds in all the other mythologies we've looked at. Shiv, Jehovah, Zeus, Wotan, all of them had the same characteristics as Lono. And they, right down to the carving on the Lono pole, it was uncanny. This time we're going to look at the second of the two attributes of the divine, and it is related to the divinity that is called Ku. I should write these things down. Ku, last time was Lono. What? Yes. So we'll read a prayer to Ku, because Ku is like the preserver. The second in most trinities is always the preserver, and the preserver is always associated with the redemptive work of healing. And this is a prayer that the kahuna says, or actually anyone can say the prayer. It's a prayer that the kahuna usually says when picking a plant to heal someone. I'll have to modify it a little bit. Ku, listen. I have come to gather for my friend this plant which was rooted in Kahiki, spread its roots in Kahiki, produced stalk in Kahiki, branched in Kahiki, leafed in Kahiki, budded in Kahiki, blossomed in Kahiki, a little tedious, but not too bad, bore fruit in Kahiki. Life is from you, O God, until he or she crawls feebly and totters in extreme old age until the blossoming time at the end. Amama, it is freed. So the whole concept of life and restorative life and healing is a concept that is associated with Ku. Last time we ran into some difficulties when we looked at Hawaiian mythology. It was so difficult to look into because the culture is different. It was a very isolated culture from the rest of the world, and the people developed their own idiosyncratic ways. And it is a culture that is different from our Western philosophy in that it is a feeling culture. We noted that right down to the language, that the Hawaiian people were feelers much more than they were thinkers. That was the way that they tended to evaluate things. So the Hawaiians expressed everything, and everything that was important to them was in emotion, in feeling, and in desire. Our society, by contrast, is much more mental, and it is materialistic. Hawaii had its own kind of materialism, which was not so possessive and not so objective as ours, but it was materialistic in the sense that materialism put together with feeling led to sensuosity, that they loved rich things. So if you put this together with the emotional qualities, the material qualities, and even the whole character of the Hawaiian Islands, what you have is something that is extremely rich, something that is luxuriant, and something that is exotic. So what we know about Hawaii is that it is, to us, an exotic place. So it isn't surprising that something like this would be the product of the tropical Hawaiian climate. But that brings up a very interesting side trip, or a very interesting demi-topic. It's something that relates to where we're trying to get to tonight, but it's a topic that is huge, and it's again one of those things that I can't go into because it's way beyond the scope of what we're trying to do. So I'll just mention some of it to make a few points and hope that somebody likes the idea and takes it up as something to study. It's something that everybody's heard of. It's called usually the nature-nurture problem, or sometimes it's called the character-culture problem. Right now, it is most ripe in our society in the controversy surrounding homosexuality. Some genetic researchers and some schools of thought among the homosexuals believe that homosexuality is a hereditary condition, or at least that there is a hereditary predisposition toward it. Proponents of this school of thought would feel that it is absurd to discriminate against homosexuals or against homosexuality, because that would be discriminating against nature. So it's very clearly a nature argument. Of course, if that's true, then one couldn't say that homosexuality was a matter of free choice, as in a gay lifestyle. Nor can one speak of freedom in it as in sexual preference, where one chooses the way of living. The other pole of the nature-nurture side claims that homosexuality is a resulting response to the psychocultural influences on the individual. And this is clearly, if it comes from society or from the family, or if it is a product of psychology, this is clearly a nature argument. Proponents of this view would say that homosexuality is clearly a matter of choice. It's a matter of preference. Of course, this would counter the genetic arguments, and it would lead to something very unpalatable, such as the idea that if something is a matter of condition, it could be reconditioned, and then you have the very controversial subject of cures, so-called cures for homosexuality, which would probably be offensive and unacceptable to even the nurture homosexuals. A few years ago, about 15 years ago, maybe even 20, probably even the late 60s, when there were all of the urban riots, the same nature-nurture battle was fought then over so-called criminal tendencies. Some people were supposedly predisposed toward criminality, and other people thought that cultural conditions are what produced riotous behavior. So those two viewpoints represented nature and nurture from 2 points, in 2 different topics. Hey, Jay. Broadly speaking, and very broadly speaking, and I don't have any biases in this way, I hope I don't, but people of the right wing tend to be nature-oriented. Even though they are inclined that way, they would probably still be offended if somebody told them that if this was the case, maybe even their argument was a product of nature and it had no validity in truth. People on the left wing tend to be more inclined toward nurture and take offense if they're called bleeding heart liberal social workers or something like that. And they would probably take offense in the same way if they were told that their argument was a product of cultural conditioning. So it's very difficult. We run into the same problems that we ran into when we were looking at Persian dualism. There are one contradiction to another, to another, to another. It's a very difficult thing. Capitalists tend to be nature-oriented, and socialists tend to be nurture-oriented. It goes so far that in the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, they even used to try to grow grain not on the basis of genetics, but on genetics as we considered anyway, but they were Lamarckian. And they thought that nurture affected, even in the short term, that it affected the genetic structure and that plants could be changed. On the other hand, organic farmers are clearly nurture-oriented, while regular old chemical farmers are clearly nature-oriented. In fact, they are so much nature-oriented that they feel that by hybridization or by genetic manipulation that they're going to do away with all the problems of pests and weeds and everything else, and that soon there won't even be a need to cultivate. All you'll have to do is plant and walk away. All right, so this is a very it's a problem, or it's a problem in the philosophical sense of the problem. It isn't a problem like, I got a problem with a bad toe or something like that, but it's a philosophical type of problem. What we're trying to get at for the Hawaiians, were the Hawaiians exotic because of their environment, or were they exotic because they were placed there because they could best work out their character? In the first case, it would be nurture. That they became exotic because they had, in some ways, a very easy life, warm temperatures and a lot of rain and an abundance of food. It's very difficult to resolve. It's a problem that never has been completely resolved, at least in a horizontal sense. There is some tendency to indicate that in the long run, nurture becomes nature. There have been some classic experiments where, for example, where they raised 2 rows of beans, and the conditions were identical between the 2 rows of beans, except that 1 row of beans for 1 hour a day, I believe it was between 11 and noon, was completely shaded for 1 hour. They like put a box over every plant in the row. At the end of the year, they were a little bit smaller, but they came to fruit just like the ones that hadn't been shaded. In the next generation, when you planted the seeds from the 2 rows, the germination was poorer in the seeds that had been shaded. And by the 3rd and 4th generation, having done this to only 1 generation, by the 3rd or 4th generation, the beans were actually absolutely stunted and deformed in their shape, and their productivity went way down. So you can say that there is something to nurture becoming nature. Or you can say it the other way around, that nature can change nurture. We see it all the time. Even in a very alkaline soil, as we have here, you put down a pine tree. The pine tree keeps dropping its needles and dropping its needles, and before too many years, the alkaline soil has become acid. So it is possible that the nature of something can be strong enough to change the environment. I can find no answer in the horizontal, in the material, that gives a complete answer to, that answers this. No final statement. However, at first it appears that mysticism, especially in its magical dimension, appears to be very much a matter of nature. If you take something like alchemy, where you can actually transform either through a plant life or through alchemical experiment or manipulation, and you can take an element and move it to a different, the life that is in it, to a different type of element. This looks like quite a statement in favor of nurture. Or if you even take the whole of the evolutionary creation, or the life that is in tranced and almost like a dead unconsciousness in the mineral kingdom over many, many, many millions of years, if it is brought to a plant-like state, an animal-like state, and waking human-like consciousness, this sounds like the ultimate of nurture. That by working with something that you can change its nature. But then you go to read spiritual works, and you read lines like, I am that I am. Or you read lines like, God can only be God. And that sounds like the ultimate of nature. God can't be anything but God. And so again, even on that level, it isn't final. But it does seem to me that ultimately nature and nurture, in their ultimate states as in evolutionary creativity, and in the basic nature of divinity, the very being of spirit itself, it seems that the two poles of nature and nurture merge in a paradoxical unity. So that even though in the realms of differentiation that we're dealing with now, they appear to be polar and opposite and separate, that ultimately they unite. You might say that in spirit, it's like the ultimate homeopathic dilution, or what do they call potency? They potentize it until everything is so rare that it's pure spirit, and even the very gross polarizations of polar opposites that ne'er the twain shall meet become united in that ultimate potency that is pure spirit. This begins to get us to where we're trying to get with Hawaiian mythology. The Hawaiian mythology is being offered as a healing or as an assuaging of the what we went through with the Persian dualism last year. So whether it is exotic humans as spiritual beings incarnated in Hawaii, and that they actually built the archetypes of the flora and fauna of Hawaii, even the climate before they came to birth, or whether it was people that were conditioned into that experience because they needed something like that for their development, it doesn't make any difference in terms of the spirit. Maybe a little of both is true, or maybe some people have it one way and some people have it another. What is important is the unity of that Hawaiian experience. Now, one of the aspects of the emotional materialism of the Hawaiian consciousness was general concretion. There are very few pure abstractions in Hawaiian mythology. It isn't like that gruesome definition of Ahriman that we saw last time in Persian mythology. He that wasn't, nor will be. I forget the exact wording, but it's nothing that abstract, and it certainly isn't something like Socrates would come up with. You could say this to some extent about all mythologies, because all mythologies are symbolism, and symbols are the necessity in order to express the spirit in the material world. That symbols become a materialistic vehicle as a gateway between our exile in materialism and the universal truths. They happen to be very flexible materialistic objects, but they are materialistic nonetheless. So Hawaiian mythology is very, very strong in concretion and not so much in abstract ideas. It's a much different kind of consciousness. Last time we were speaking of Lono objects. That is, things that were sacred to Lono. We said that Lono, like Zeus, was associated with the Io, and the two Lono objects were the food gourd, which was almost perfectly spherical, and the Lono pole, which was something like the shivling, or the phallus of Bacchus, that was carried around at the Bacchanalia. It was carried around all of the islands. And when we looked at these things, we noted that these objects, with a concrete sense of the Hawaiians, became more than symbols. They became like totem objects, in that they would be preserved and they would be enshrined in special areas. And if you had a hut or something like that, they would be in the right direction, in the right corner of the hut, to express what they were supposed to express. So that's one example of the character of the concretion of the Hawaiians. The concrete nature of the consciousness of the Hawaiians, when we get to the second attribute of spirit, brings out some unusual facets out of the second attribute of the spirit. The second attribute of the spirit, as we have mentioned numerous times in Western mysticism, is called the life spirit. In the Orient, it's called the Buddhic plane. And that level of consciousness transcends the human spirit, which is in the region of abstract or ideational thought. So it transcends beyond ideas, and it transcends beyond principles. Now you can see the difficulties that a very concrete consciousness would have with this kind of problem to deal with, a very abstracted abstraction. So it is given a divinity, and that divinity is Ku, who is one step beyond Lono, you might say. However, you almost never hear of Ku alone. He's always associated with his divine wife and his divine counterpart. You never hear of Ku alone. This is where the unity that transcends ideas comes in. Ku is always associated with Hina. They're always together, and they're very rarely ever separated. This is, in fact, there is more attention usually given to Hina than is given to Ku, which is befitting because the second attribute, as an even number and as the pure imagination, the source of all of the ideas, the womb that is immaculate of all differentiation, is the divine feminine. And so it appears that's a very befitting thing. To give an example of the union of Ku and Hina, Ku is a sky god, in that same sense that Uranus is a sky god in the Olympian mythology when we looked at that. But when one sees Ku as heaven or as the sky, then Hina becomes earth. And together they represent heaven and earth. And it's amazing when you start looking at the conception of it, the way it is stated, and the character of heaven and earth is just exactly like Shu and Tefnut, who were born from Re in the Egyptian mythology. I'm just astounded that here, an isolated society, thousands of miles away from anyone, which developed its own religious and spiritual worship, developed so many commonalities with every other mythology in the world at a different time, from different times and different locations. Now we have to clarify something. Last time we said that Lono was associated with the sky. But Lono is again associated with the sky in terms of objects. Lono is associated with the clouds. And Lono is associated with the stars and not with the whole idea of the heavens alone. So it's the objects that are in the heaven, while Ku is the heaven itself. Both Lono and Ku Hina are gods of fertility. If you think of fertility, fertility is the worldly or material way of describing creativity. Spirit by nature is creative. And creation, when we see it in the material world, is fertility. However, the fertility is different. The fertility of Lono is generative fertility. It is the generation of objects or of things. It's the reproductive process where there is an offspring, whether it is a new plant or whether it is a new fish. It is generative creativity or fertility that is associated with Lono. With Ku, the fertility and the creativity is general. That is, it is overall. And this very much relates to the whole idea that the life spirit transcends the specific objectification of something as an idea or as a principle. The word Ku means upright. Rising upright is literally what the word means. The word Hina means leaning down. So the word Ku is associated with the vertical. Hina is associated with the horizontal. And so the Ku Hina together in union become what we call the addition sign. But it is not addition as we think of addition, 1 + 1 or something like that, because that would be the generation of a new number, and that would be like Lono, or like the third attribute. That would be like Jehovah, the Lord of individual fertility. It means more the sense of the sum total. So that everything in the Hawaiian language, in the Hawaiian conceptology of relating to the world that we see around us, was related through the Ku Hina vertical and horizontal. Like, for example, the horizon being horizontal related to Hina. And the rising sign was Hinakua, which means back. Whereas the setting sun, or the west, was called Hinaalo, or front. And so the rising sun related to those who were to come, just as it always has in Christianity and every other Western religion, those who were to come. Whereas the setting sun relates to the ancestors and to all the people who are present now. And if we look at this conception, it is again almost exactly identical to the notion of Re. Re Kepfer as the rising sun, the promise of new fertility, and Atum Ra as the setting sun, God incarnate in human forms. So the same notions are present in all. So, Ku is the masculine of fecundity. Fecundity is probably the best word for the Ku Hina. And Hina is the feminine. And together they represent all fecundity. It is such that you can't separate the projective from the receptive. The unity that transcends even ideas, that is the light of pure truth that goes beyond any particular truth, that is indivisible and inseparable. And so Ku Hina are almost, you can't take them apart. But everything related to them. Like if there was a vertical pointed stone, that was called Poha Ku. That was Ku-like. However, if you had a flat rounded stone, that was called Papa O Hina. And the Hawaiians even had myths and tales that if you put a Ku stone together with a Hina stone, that you had stone children. Yeah, they have a lovely, pretty little consciousness. The breadfruit tree, which was upright, was called Uluku. And the spreading branch trees were called Uluhapapa. And they were all sacred to Hina because they spread out and they were all horizontal. It's just a beautiful way of doing things. Again, we had that whole idea that everything in life is sacred. I think we've brought this topic up a number of times, that if you go far enough back at Ila, sometimes we go through and do Havans. And if you listen to the chants out of the Sanskrit, most of the words in there, or a good number of the words in there, are names of divinities, even though they're acting as words. And this is the same tendency among the Hawaiians. It is that everything goes back to the gods and everything is a manifestation of the gods. So, along similar lines, the sea, the fecund sea, was ruled by Ku. But relative to the sea, the fertile land that was encompassed by the sea was of Hina. However, when you got on land, the upland was ruled by Ku because it was up there, whereas the shoreland or the lowland of any of the Hawaiian islands was ruled by Hina. In fact, even the whole calendar was broken into two major seasons, as you'd expect in the tropics. Two major seasons. The seasons, the Ku seasons, were when the people on the shore looked to the uplands for the ripening of the fruit. And the Hina seasons were when the people who were in the uplands came down to the shore to do ocean fishing and surfing. And so it was it's like the whole society relates back and relates right back to the gods. In fact, backward from the speaker and forward from the speaker and upward from the speaker and downward from the speaker and large and large and small and hard and soft, and all of those were Ku Hina words. In fact, your whole relationship to space and to time in the calendar and in the way you looked at things in the sensible dimensionality were related to Ku and Hina. Pat's going to be listening to this tape, and I think not the next class, but the class following this, when she's had a chance to hear all 3 tapes, Pat's going to come in and do some hula for us, and we'll have a good old time. Pat Roll, she knows all forms of world dance, and she's traveled the whole world over. She's even danced to Bulgarian bagpipes, if you've ever heard of such a thing. All right. So we're talking about the second attribute of the Trinity. And 2 means polarity or directions of extremity, male and female. Thus, the quality of Ku Hina as representing the second attribute of the divine represent a special quality, as you might expect with sensible materialistic people, of the second attribute, and that is the meeting place of paradoxical opposites. So their conception of paradoxical opposites is in its polarized paradox very much like the polarized paradox of the Satori experience of the life spirit in Zen Buddhism. There is the being, not being type of quality, and all those opposites meet there. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. So this is stating, like in the consciousness of the Hawaiians, this is where nature and nurture and every other kind of opposition comes together. This is really like, even if you take the ideas behind words, the favorite, for example, of Sigmund Freud. And there are about at least 20 or 30 such words that you can find, but the word cleave means both to separate and to hold together. As you say in The Man Who Got the Butcher Knife, that he could cut through the 4 loaves of bread at the same time he had a 4-loaf cleaver. And in the case of the man who unites with his wife forever and ever, a man shall cleave to his wife. So the 2, there's that kind of union of extreme opposites. This is the reason why we're taking up the Hawaiian mythology, because it's perfectly healing. After the Zoroastrianism, where we learned about the separative quality of dualism, we need to see the unified quality of dualism, and that's why we're looking at this society for a little bit of emotional or psychological healing. The Persian dualism was very divisive, very distinctive, and it was meant to foster separativeness. It was meant to foster individuation. However, if you live on a small island, there the dualism has to unify people, just as feeling tends to unify people. Rudolf Steiner, when he sent his disciples out into the world to share the gospel of anthroposophy, gave a series of lectures on how to share anthroposophy. And he said, if you're speaking, he said, you always focus on feeling. Because with feeling, there is sympathy, there is empathy, there's something very unifying. Whereas if you rely on one of the other powers of the spirit, willing or thinking, you have the opposite effect. That if you make your talks to be something of a willing nature, this brings out the independence in every person in your audience, and you run into a huge battle of wills where you're trying to force something down somebody's throat. However, if you make things to be too much a matter of thinking, the thinking is an isolative process. We talked about it last week, where in the thinking process, the thinker is awakened. The selfhood is awakened in the process of forming concrete thoughts. And therefore, any exercise that is an exercise of deep concentration, where one produces discrete thoughts, one automatically transcends to a meditative state as a result of concentration, because that is the effect. And so there is something separative in thinking. So it seems not at all surprising that the feelingful society of Hawaii would find its feet, so to speak, so that it could walk or so that it could run in the second attribute of the divine. Let's look at it another way. In Persia, especially northern Persia, where the nomads started the whole Persian society, this was in the heart of the largest continent on earth. A person could ride a horse for many days on end without ever coming to the end of land. Now contrast that with Hawaii, which is basically a scattering of islands, where from the top of most any island you can see the entirety of the island. When you look at the concept of heaven and earth, if you are a Persian and you're experiencing the world closed off from the spiritual continuity, and if you're experiencing the world externally, you see then two massive, parallel, unending spheres, one being heaven, one being earth. However, if you're seeing earth relative to the sea, you see something very, very different. You don't see the formidable opposites that resulted in the continuous struggle of Persia and the irreconcilable problem of theodicy. Either God is impotent or in not being able to overcome evil, or God is separate. There's one God of good and one God of evil. So that's something that was never resolved among the different schools of Zoroastrian thought. What the Hawaiians could see, at least relative to manifest land, was the conception of kuhina, that this is all there is. You can see the whole island. It's again the notion of a total. And so the relationship of the island to the sea is a very different kind of thing. It is something more like the artist's object, like if you take a statue by, oh my goodness, what was that wonderful Frenchman? They had his works here back in, what? Yes. Where he very much, Rodin, he used the negative space, that when you look at his objects, you saw something beyond the objects. And this is the way the kuhina totality worked. You had a sensuous, sensible object, the island, versus the sea. Then you had the whole earth relative to the sky. And it's a very lovely way of looking at it. Now, this is what happens with feelers who live on islands. Let's look at what happens when you have thinkers who live on islands. We have two very good examples of that in history. We have British people and the Japanese. Both island societies, both highly intellectual. And they had a mental character. Just even mentioning the two societies makes them stand out right away. They had the island environment, and so they had the manifest objectivity. However, this was put together with the separative, mental kinds of consciousness. with an intellectual temperament. And this is sort of like having an object in your hand. You know, with a mental object, you can look at it from all the perspectives. You can turn it and look at it. And you see this is all there is, but in a very different way than with the emotional. The emotional says this is all there is, and it unifies with it. With the intellectual, the process of thinking, I see what this curve means and what the general shape and feel of this is. It separates one from the object. And so you have then a very separative kind of process that leads to ego isolation. So it isn't surprising that we have people like David Hume or Bishop Berkeley who became intellectual empiricists, or that we have, for example, on the island of Zealand, we have Hamlet, who is also very much of a thinker and very much separative and not being able to hold it together. So if you have the intellectual isolationism, you have then in the insecurity of being separate from everything, the human spirit then tries to overcompensate. And if you just think of one word, imperialism, and you think of British imperialism and Japanese imperialism, or the people developing island nations that are intellectual, how they overcompensated, So we have that kind of imperialism. And when the person becomes too self-conscious and has to deal with the elements of life, both Japan and British are noted for their stoicism, as, for example, in Heracles or in the temperament of Shakespeare. A lot of stoicism. Now, there are other island nations, but they're different. Like if we take the Philippines or Indonesia, these are island nations also. However, what happens there is they are of very mixed ethnicity. And there you have a consciousness of a struggle. And you have very strongly marked ethnic groups, because the only way you can grow or the only way you can defend yourself is if the other ethnic group becomes smaller. So it's a totally different kind of consciousness. We see that even to this day in Indonesia now. And what was the massacre just a few years ago? My memory is terrible tonight. There's no reason for it. Do you know what I'm talking about?
You mean the killing field?
No. East Timor. Yes, when they tried to wipe out all of the people, and they did a pretty good job, too. If you can call something like that. Good. All right. This may even be what is part of the situation in Northern Ireland. Same kind of thing. Two cultural differences locked in an island type of consciousness. So that's the difference between an intellectual or a mixed versus an emotional island society. All right, we've said just a few minutes ago that the quality of a feeling character is to be sympathetic or empathetic in unification. So the dualism in Hawaii took the form of upland and downland, or land and water, or heaven and earth, as, again, a total quality. Now, it's almost impossible to speak of complete unity. The spiritual experience in its oneness has about it ineffability. If one tries to speak even in pointing in that direction, the words come out almost as little islands in something that is very unified. So there is in the island experience something like our conscious experience in trying to talk about unity. But this is the real value that Hawaiian-like consciousness has, in that sympathy where the part and the negative space, so to speak, form the whole, this is a very simple way to take the simplest differentiation, dualism, and use it not to have antipathetic opposites or antithetical opposites to each other, but to use the two poles, the small and the large, to point to unity. Instead of looking at polarization as something to differentiate and to separate people, it can be, by this turn, it can be to unify people. It's a way to describe the whole thing in the simplest way possible. The whole thing is this, and everything that isn't this. That's really a nice way of doing that. Now, it's true that in our society we tend to be materialistic and mental. Our whole material science and technology paradigm has that quality about it. But I think we're coming to the place now where we're becoming consummate human beings, where we're becoming whole human beings. And with that being the case, whether something was developed in Hawaii or whether it was developed 10,000 years ago, it doesn't make any difference. When we become whole human beings, we are then free to use what has been developed by all of society in our own consciousness. And I find it for myself a very healthy way of looking at the world, rather than having a fragmented and ever disparate society or view of the world, to look at the opposites as a way of designating the whole. Not only that, you can, even as non-feeling people, we can use, each of us has our tendencies toward thinking or feeling or intuiting more, choosing one more over the other. But I'm speaking societally now. Even that is, it doesn't have to be limited to dualism. It can be in pluralism. You can add more and more things, and you don't have to get to all of them. But the more you add, you can look at them rather than looking at a miscellaneous collection of things. You can look at them as being representational of the whole and describing the whole. So the whole idea of the Hawaiian type of dualism leads to a really healthy view of multiplicity. We are at a time in the evolution of consciousness where the religion is passing from the religion of the Holy Spirit to the religion of the Christ. That is, we talked about this last time, the religion, things begin with the religion of the first, and then they go to the religion of the second, and then to the religion of the third, and then back to the second, and then back to the first. This is a very common top-down and returning bottom-up. What the Hawaiian consciousness tells us is that the relationship of the second to the first is that it transcends and includes second to the third, is that it transcends and includes everything of the third in essence, in the truth of all things, without it having to be something separate. And if the third, the self, is our identity, as we individuate, the more that we individuate, it is now becoming wise to balance our individuation with the in the third with the second. That is, with the other. The essence of Christianity or Buddhism is of the other, not of the self, not of individuation. And we develop more of, if we don't develop this giving of ourselves over to the total, to the other, or if we don't look at others for our orientation, we are in danger of the kind of insanity of Hamlet, where the self, everything devolves onto the self, and it becomes more and more separative, and one becomes more and more indecisive because one is separated from the healing quality, again, that comes from the second. And so there has to be a corresponding shift with individuation to giving oneself over to the other. This is why, like in street language, why people have a very simple experience that is very healing to them when they are involved in Orthodox Christianity. They may not understand the total of it, but when they give their life over to Christ, it absolves them of undue personal responsibility or the nervous intellectual separation that comes with that kind of outlook. So this is something that we can use in our whole spiritual development. The second, or the life spirit, is the feeler, as we have said. The first is willing, the second is feeling, the third is thinking or conceiving. But if you look in a vertical sense, the second transcends the third. It is the light of truth that is found in all of the ideas. It is the general beingness that is found in all individual beings. And so in this particular way, the second has both the character of thinking in that it has the quality of truth, or as Christ says, I am the truth. And it has the character of feeling at the same time, and it leads to a more total kind of consciousness. By giving ourselves over to the total truth of what might be called the spiritual feminine, the individual is nurtured, and the thinking and feeling fall into place with each other, and there's the kind of union that takes place that we saw before, that nature and nurture come into a wondrous unity. So do thinking and feeling come into a common unity. And in a way, it's the Hawaiians help us define that. All right. I want to go a little bit further with this. In fact, quite a bit further. The conception of islands pervades all of Hawaiian thought, such that the kahunas... Is that too hot for you, that light?
Not hot.
It's just bearing down on you. I can still read the notes anyway, I guess. So that the kahunas, who were seers, describe the objectified part of the chaos of the spiritual worlds that they see, which are just so filled with everything. The objectified part that they understand, they describe as islands. Like each of the spiritual worlds, the desire world, or any subplane in there, the part that they bring to their consciousness, they describe that as an island. And the ultimate of this is kahiki, which was just in that prayer that we read. Kahiki was the island, meaning the whole transcendental world from which the gods came to here. All of the gods came to from Kahiki, and they brought everything that's good in this world. By the way, on the north wall in the front room here is a series of drawings by Olive Wicker, who was an artist and studied together with mathematicians, studying projective geometry in such a way as to see how from the womb of infinite space forms come into being. So those drawings of platforms that are on that wall are meant to bring your consciousness to the idea of objects being formed from an infinite space that is flat. I don't know how to say it, but when you take spatial ideas and carry them out to their infinite, everything appears to be flat, such that if you take, like this corner, if you put your head in this corner and look out and carry this, and this out to infinity, if you carry out the 3 dimensions of space that are in a Cartesian coordinate, a 3-dimensional Cartesian coordinate, if you carry them out to infinity, they become the points of an equilateral triangle. They're all equidistant. If you're right in the center looking out, they all carry out as far as you can carry them. They become an equilateral triangle. And it is that idea of how from that flat space which represents spirituality, in one sense, how they are focused down into flat objects is what those things are about. So they saw everything as islands. And everything that was objectified they saw as an island. You know, we see this in Ireland too with that song, a little bit of heaven fell to earth and it became Ireland. The same kind of idea. All right, I've got to look at another facet of Kuhina now. And that is, when we're dealing with the second, we're dealing with 2. And 2 is the first and most primary form of pluralism. 1 is 1 and always will be 1. 1 is in everything, but unity is itself indivisible. Every number is divisible by 1, but 1 is divisible by none. All you get is a fraction. But when you state 1, if you delineate 1, you have polarization. And with polarization comes plurality. Whether it's by adding 1 plus 1 plus 1 or 2 plus 1, you always are producing plurals. Or if you do it by multiplying and take each of the poles and double them and then each of the poles and polarize them, you go, 2, 4, 8. So there is the quality of 2 is pluralism. The pluralism is brought to fruition in the third, in that it becomes objects, or it becomes selves, or it becomes ones. Unity through internal dualization becomes individualities. That is to say that the unity of consciousness of the Spirit, in knowing its being, knows that there is something that it potentially is not. And when that is internalized, that not being is internalized, that becomes the pluralistic womb of conception out of which the third, a being, is produced. And when that becomes objectified, the idea of self, the idea of God, and the idea of self as God are called the Immaculate Conception. This is another way of saying that the Father, through the Divine Mother, gives birth to the Divine Child and gives birth to itself. There is no God without that coming to a conception of a God out of spiritual unity. In this sense, the internal dualization, the unified dualization of the second, is the ever-conceiver. It's sometimes called the alone begotten, because through that womb everything comes into existence. Because of this quality of pluralism, once an individual and one is born, many are born. So we're saying that, again, let's go back to our clunky picture of the eye, and this being the plane between the phenomenal and the transcendental, that the one manifest as light focuses through and becomes ones and becomes forms of ones. And once one is created, many are created. But by reflection, the lens of mind, or the lens of divine mind, it reflects back, and when once anyone is born, the divinity is born. So what we're looking at is birth of separate individuals and birth of the divine. Now, last time we saw the third as the focusing agency. And we saw Lono then as the focus of conception. As such, all thirds represent gods of generation, and last time we saw of fertility. However, all of the attributes of spirit are creative, and therefore they're all fertile. In the lush Hawaiian Islands, where there is lots of rainfall, the rain was sacred to Kuhina, because it came down from above. It came down from the sky. It was divine life. It was divine healing. It was divine fertility. And the water in all societies has been an emblem of feeling. So all of these things all tied back together. So Kuhina also represent fertility, but they do in a different way. We just now looked and we saw that the second represents pluralism. So Kuhina can also represent fertility in the sense of pluralism. Not in the same way that Luno did as generative, but in a more general and in a more virgin fertility. Kuhina represented the distilled water. The sea around the islands was undrinkable. It produced fish and all of the things that they loved, the kelp and all of that, but it couldn't be drunk. Whereas the water that came from Kuhina was pure. It was virgin. And the same is true of the fish ponds. The fish ponds were sacred to Kuhina because there they grew the freshwater fish that they could control. They didn't have to have a good day or a bad day of fishing. They could control the fish ponds. And fish have always been associated with the second. So I want to do a little reading again here so we actually have something from the Hawaiians in the talk. O Kuhina, soften your land that it may bring forth. Bring forth where? Bring forth in the sea. Bring forth squid, ula fish, etc. Encourage your land to bring forth. Bring forth where? Bring forth on land potatoes, taro, gourds, coconuts, bananas, calabashes. Encourage your land to bring forth what? Bring forth men, women, children, pigs, fowl, food, land. Encourage your land to bring forth. Bring forth what? Bring forth chiefs, commoners, pleasant living. Bring about goodwill, ward off ill will. So there is a immaculate fertility that is associated with Kuhina that is like the distillate of water. Now, last time we mentioned Lono as the root of dynasty. All selves go back to the one self. It's the same conception. Everything, eventually, we get narrower and narrower until we finally get to the point where we can leap up and transcend into the spirit. And anyone, whether it is divine or human or demigod, that comes to a knowledge of self has its dynastic origin of its form and even its consciousness in the phenomenal world. It has its root in Lono, or in the third. We also mentioned last time that there were dynasties of gods. There were whole dynasties of Lono gods, and there were dynasties of Ku gods, and there were dynasties of Hina gods. In fact, Hina is probably the most common name in divinity and in for people's names in all of Hawaii. You find a lot of Hinas there. Hina is also the name for the moon. And again, this is very much like Greco-Roman mythology, where the moon was given as many names as anything. That was one of the gifts that was given. So I want to talk a little bit here. I'll read a little bit about the some of the Ku gods. It's a very mundane thing. Oh boy, here we go. Ku makuhali'i, Ku spreading over the land. Ku pulu pulu, Ku of the undergrowth. Ku olono no wa'o, Ku of the deep forest. Ku holo holo pali, Ku sliding down deep steeps. Ku pe pe iao loa, and Ku pe pe ialo poko, meaning big-eared and small-eared kuna. Ku pa aike'e, Ku adzing out the canoe. Ku mauna, Ku of the mountain. Ku ka ohialaka, Ku of the ohialaka tree. Ku ka ia, Ku of the wild panda swine. And it just goes on like that. Ku of the digging stick, Ku of dry farming, Ku of wet farming. And these are all addresses to different attributes of Ku, but these different attributes of Ku were seen as whole clans of Ku gods, all of which went back to the central Ku source. The same thing, there are whole dynasties of Hina gods, and they all go back to a common origin. Now, in this example here, these are very mundane and very earthly activities that are associated with Ku and to things that have to be taken care of in the earth. But that's not the kind of Ku fertility and Ku activity that I'm really interested in. But I'm interested more in the immaculate or virgin fertility or plurality. This might be called transcendent fertility or transcendent plurality. Since the second, or the life spirit, or the Buddhic consciousness, is beyond ideation, it is so lofty that in its unity, as we said before, it can barely be spoken of. And we can only point to it. But if we're going to have any inspirational value for any of us out of these talks, and if there's anything for us to aspire to, we do have to point, even though the pointing may be very inadequate. The ideational side of the lens of the mind is both a focal agency and it is a reflective agency. When it reflects the beingness of the divine spirit through the light of the life spirit, and it reflects back a focus of that light as the human spirit, that is called immaculate conception. It has always been considered that. Now this conception, since the lens of mind is universal, is not singular. That is to say, once God is born, gods are born. Once a transcendent self is born, the plurality of the second gets magnified through many gods. Yes, there is one central or one overall, but that is so democratic that the different, you can't even call them foci. You can say foci, but that's too particular. What's probably better is facets. Facets of one gigantic jewel. So there is then a legion of God, or of gods or goddesses. The reflection is pluralized. Now what we want to get at in this pluralization is something that's so awesome, I don't know how I can even put it into words. The life spirit, that creativity, or that fertility that is represented by the union of paradoxical opposites, is so live, it is perpetually alive. And it is perpetually recreating itself. So that it is perpetually recreating itself in a way that it seems like instantaneous, continuous, and eternal rebirth of self. This is sometimes called a memory, because reflected from the lens of spirit is not only the conception of self or of godhood, but every conception, the conception of roundness, or the conception of levity, any abstract idea is itself reflected. Thus, everything that comes into manifest creation is formed by the unification of divine ideas, and everything that comes into manifestation is in idea or in transcendence, reflected also back into the light of the second, back into the kuhina. And some people describe this as a memory. But it's not a memory like the memory in the reflecting ether, or what is called the Akashic memory, which is made by the energy impressing itself, and what it is impressed in holds that impression. It's a very faint, but you can call back thousands of years of history with that by looking into that memory. It's not a memory like in the region of concrete thought, where the thought form is itself forged into the thoughts that become the things of reality, the living archetypes that sing everything into existence. They're sort of like playing pitch pipes. They're empty vacuums, and everything gets drawn into form around them. There, the memory is not impressed, but it is informed right into the archetypal receptive thought form. What happens in the life spirit is not an impression. It is a perpetual rebirth. So then every conception and every manifest thing that has come about as a consequence of united conceptions is perpetually reborn, is perpetually re-enlivened in the life spirit. So this goes on almost to infinity. The memory of nature in the world of thought goes millions of years. But the so-called memory, the rebirth of the idea of life or the idea of truth in all of its many ideational forms, is reborn beyond the conception of time almost that we have. So it is not possible to have an impression there. So what we have then are perpetual remembering or bringing back to life. This is what the education was to Plato. Plato said that all education is memory. And modern philosophers now claim that this was his superstitious belief in reincarnation and that education was just remembering what we had learned before. That's not what it is. If you read in the Meno by Plato, where Socrates takes the boy and has him, who is unmathematically trained, and has him prove a theorem of an isosceles right triangle just by saying whether he thinks this statement is true or not true. There's no memory of something from a past life. What he is doing at every moment is remembering the intuition, the spirit of truth, that pure light that goes in all conceptions, and at each step that he remembers that truth, he learns and he knows that something is true. The poet David White, who all of us have been listening to with awe, notes somewhere along the line that the Greek word for truth is aletheia. Leth was the river of forgetfulness, and aletheia means without forgetfulness. So education or truth or awareness or perpetual rebirth in the spirit, not only in self but in everything, is a perpetual remembrance or a taking note of the truth. So when Christ is saying in the communion, "This do in remembrance of me," he's not merely talking about eating and drinking, and he's not merely talking about performing some sacrament. He's saying that the communion with the life spirit, with the unified truth, with the Kuhina principle, is a perpetual remembering or taking that life. And that's basically what the Kuhina idea of Hawaiian mythology is saying. It is saying, take life. That's it. Under 90 minutes. Wow. Earl isn't making it anymore, huh?
Yes, no.
Oh, too bad. Questions?
Yeah, getting back to your island analogy between the Japanese and the English and the Hawaiians. It also occurred to me that Japan and England knew they were separate, which might have given them part of the separatist notion.
Oh, yes.
The Hawaiians were in their own
but
element, only those islands.
To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. They have, running throughout their mythology, it's pretty clear archaeologically that the Hawaiians were emigres from Tahiti. The myths cross-correlate, the language cross-correlates, and they have this idea of being pilgrims from Tahiti. And there's a common notion of a theme that it runs again throughout mythology, but it's very predominant in Hawaiian mythology, of being pilgrims that have come from somewhere else. But even that somewhere else is an idea. Well, thank you guys very much.